Tonight, we will tell you a story not of epic battles or mythical beasts, but of a quiet revolution that shaped families, kingdoms, and even the very fabric of society in the Middle Ages. It's the story of how love, or rather marriage, worked in a time when hearts were often secondary to land and lineage. You will discover why a wedding was less about romance and more about a contract, how parents negotiated the future of their children like chess pieces on a grand board, and what truly defined a good match when personal feelings were often an afterthought. We will explore the strict rules imposed by both church and custom, the subtle dance of dowries and dower, and the surprising role of consent in an age where choice seemed almost non-existent. You will learn about the formal promises that bound young souls, the public ceremonies that sealed their fate, and the private moments that made a union valid. And finally, we will touch upon the fleeting ideals of courtly love that dared to challenge the cold realities of arranged unions, and the rare instances when fate or desperation allowed for a different path. Oh, and if you enjoy these stories that not only lull you to sleep, but also expand your understanding of the world, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the past. Here, dreams meet knowledge, and every night offers a new discovery. All right, find a comfortable spot, perhaps nestled under a warm blanket. Let your shoulders relax, your breath deepen, and allow your body to sink into the quiet comfort of your surroundings. Release the day's concerns. They can wait until morning. Imagine a world where destiny was often decided long before a first glance, where two lives were woven together, not by a fleeting emotion, but by the careful calculations of power and prestige. In those distant centuries, when kingdoms were a mosaic of lands and power was passed down not by law but by the strength of one's family, marriage was rarely a matter of the heart. You may be used to thinking of a wedding as the union of two loving souls, but for most people in the Middle Ages, especially those from noble families, it was something else entirely. Imagine a world where every plot of land, every castle, every knight was part of someone's power, and that power was constantly under threat. In such conditions, marriage became one of the most powerful tools for survival and prosperity. The primary purpose of marriage in those times was to strengthen a family's position. Lords and ladies, counts and dukes, kings and queens, each thought not in terms of personal happiness, but of their family's future. This was a deep, systemic understanding. If you had vast lands but lacked the warriors to defend them, you sought an ally. If your neighbor was powerful but had a long-standing dispute with your family, a marriage could be the bridge that led to peace, or even to the absorption of his domains. The main factors determining the choice of a spouse were land, power, and lineage. Land holdings were the foundation of wealth and might. The more land a family controlled, the more resources it had, the more knights it could field, and the higher its status. Therefore, when it came to marriage, parents and sometimes entire councils of nobility carefully studied the map. They looked at what lands a potential bride or groom would bring to the union. A marriage could unite two separate estates, creating a single, stronger county or duchy. It could secure access to strategically important trade routes or ports, which brought colossal revenues. Sometimes, a marriage was a way to acquire lands to which a family had old but weak claims. After a few generations, thanks to cleverly concluded marriages, a small holding could grow into a significant duchy, and a duchy could become the basis for a kingdom. Power went hand in hand with land. A marriage between two influential families created a mighty alliance capable of resisting enemies, supporting claims to a throne, or even overthrowing undesirable rulers. Choosing a spouse from a family that already had strong connections at court or controlled key positions was priceless. It opened doors to royal favors, to favorable court rulings, and to military reinforcements when needed. Sometimes, marriage was a way to consolidate newly won power. If a new ruler came to power by the sword, he needed to ally with the local nobility to secure his legitimacy and support. In this case, the daughter of an influential local lord, even if her lands were modest, could be the ideal bride, bringing not so much wealth as political stability. Lineage, or the line of succession, was the third but no less important pillar. In a society where everything depended on one's origins, the purity of a family's bloodline was of enormous importance. Marriages were made to ensure the continuation of the family, especially male heirs who could inherit titles and lands. If a family had no sons, a married daughter could pass her inheritance rights to her husband and their future children, thus keeping the lands in the hands of, if not her own family name, then at least an allied one. Sometimes marriages were arranged to purify or improve a bloodline by marrying into older, more respected, or even royal dynasties. This enhanced the family's prestige, gave it the right to claim higher positions, and strengthened its position in the noble hierarchy. Ancient coats of arms, legends of glorious ancestors, all this was part of the dowry, no less valuable than gold or land. Therefore, when you imagine a medieval betrothal, think not of secret meetings under the moon, but of long hours of negotiations between fathers, of checking land deeds, of calculating the number of nights a particular family could field. The decision to marry was not made by the young people, but by the elders of the family, who saw each union as a chess move that determined the fate not only of two individuals, but of an entire dynasty for decades or even centuries to come. It was a world where every wedding ring was not just a symbol of love, but the seal on a strategic treaty. When the time for such a union arrived, the first step was a meticulous search for a suitable candidate. This was not a matter of chance or personal choice, as it often is today. Parents, burdened with the immense responsibility for their family's future, began a complex, multi-stage process that more closely resembled state negotiations than wedding preparations. They relied on their extensive networks of connections, other noble families, royal courts, influential clergy, and even carefully filtered rumors that traveled with merchants, minstrels, and pilgrims. The goal was not to find a soulmate or romantic attachment, but to discover a family whose interests aligned with their own, whose wealth could complement their current holdings, and whose reputation was impeccable, untarnished by scandal or questionable alliances. Often, so-called matchmakers were involved in this process, though their role was not always formalized in the modern sense. They could be respected aunts who knew all the family trees in the region, experienced servants who had faithfully served the family for years and knew all its secrets and ambitions, or even monks and nuns who acted as intermediaries between noble houses. using their trusted position and access to information unavailable to ordinary people. They did not just connect people, they conducted deep preliminary research, gathering information about the health of a potential bride or groom, their character, their education, and any hidden debts or land disputes that might surface after the wedding. These agents operated with the utmost caution and confidentiality to avoid public shame and loss of face if negotiations failed for any reason. Any leak of information could cause irreparable damage to a family's reputation. After the list of potential candidates was narrowed down to the most suitable few, official envoys came into play. These were the most trusted individuals of the family head. Perhaps his eldest son, if he was mature enough, a loyal and renowned knight, a skilled lawyer specializing in land matters, or even an influential bishop who could act as a guarantor of the deal. They were sent on journeys, sometimes hundreds of miles, through forests and mountains, to personally assess the situation and conduct final negotiations. These visits were staged with great pomp and ceremony, showcasing the wealth and status of the sending party, but their true purpose remained strictly practical and commercial. They were not only to deliver the proposal, but also to conduct a thorough inspection. The envoys carefully examined the lands offered as a dowry, assessing the condition of the castles, the number of vassals, and the quality of the harvest. They also closely observed the future spouse. For a bride, this could mean an inspection of her physical health, appearance, ability to manage a household and servants, her piety, and even the presence of scars or defects that could affect childbirth or status. For a groom, his martial skills, piety, ability to manage his domains, and his conduct in society were evaluated. The negotiations were incredibly long and tedious, sometimes lasting for months or even years, interrupted by long periods of waiting for answers and new proposals. They covered every aspect of the future union. The size of the dowry the bride would bring to her new family, often lands, money, jewelry, or even rights to certain incomes, and the dower, property the husband set aside for his wife in case of his death to ensure her a dignified existence. Issues of inheritance, land division, living conditions, and the political and military obligations the new alliance imposed on both families were all discussed. Every point was a subject of bargaining, and each side sought to maximize its gain while minimizing risks. These negotiations were often accompanied by the exchange of expensive gifts, official letters sealed with family crests, and even poetic messages meant to emphasize the nobility of their intentions. But beneath the outward courtesy and politeness lay a hard, pragmatic calculation. The children, whose fates were being decided at the table of these complex negotiations, usually had no say or any significant influence on the outcome. Their opinion, if it was asked at all, was considered secondary to the higher interests of the family and lineage. Sometimes, the young people, especially if they were old enough, might be allowed to meet before the wedding. But this was more the exception than the rule. Even such meetings were strictly controlled to prevent the emergence of undesirable romantic feelings, or, conversely, an open refusal that could undermine the entire process. If one of the parties showed reluctance, or even worse, openly opposed the marriage, it could lead to an immediate breakdown of negotiations and even a serious diplomatic scandal. which could have far-reaching consequences for the reputation of both families, sometimes escalating into long feudal disputes or even wars. Thus, the entire process of searching and negotiating was a complex and carefully calibrated dance of power, calculation, and etiquette, where every step was planned and every gesture had meaning, all to ensure the stability and prosperity of the lineage for generations to come, often at the expense of the personal happiness of those who were to enter into this marital union. You understand now that these unions were not born from tender whispers or shared dreams, but from the stark realities of power and continuity. At the very heart of these intricate negotiations, the most critical element lay in the careful calculation of property. This was not a mere detail. It was the foundation upon which a medieval marriage was built, ensuring the prosperity of the new couple and the enduring strength and status of both families. For noble families, the dowry, known as dos in Latin, was paramount. You can imagine it as the bride's essential contribution, a substantial offering brought from her family to the groom or his lineage. This was more than personal belongings. It was a complex package designed to secure her position and enhance the new household's wealth. The dowry took many forms, depending on the status and resources of the bride's family. Often, it comprised valuable tracts of land, fertile fields, or strategically vital forests, holdings that could expand a family's territorial influence. Sometimes, it was a considerable sum of money, perhaps bags of silver coins, or a substantial annual income derived from rents and tolls. Once the financial terms of dowry and dower were meticulously negotiated and agreed upon, the path to a medieval marriage led to a pivotal and legally binding step, the betrothal, known in Latin as sponsalia. This was not merely a casual engagement as we understand it today. It was a solemn, formal promise of future marriage, carrying immense legal and social weight. For noble families, this agreement was often established when the prospective bride and groom were still very young, sometimes even in childhood. The church recognized these early arrangements, provided they were made with the consent of the parents or guardians, who acted on behalf of their minor children. The sponsalia ceremony itself, though varying in specific regional customs, typically involved a public declaration of intent. It was usually held in a formal setting, perhaps within the great hall of a lord's castle or a designated chamber, where all could witness the gravity of the occasion. The families would gather, often accompanied by trusted advisors, legal representatives, and prominent members of their respective communities. The atmosphere was one of hushed anticipation and solemnity, a stark contrast to the boisterous feasts that might follow. The young betrothed individuals, perhaps only children, would stand before their elders, their futures already mapped out for them. The agreement was often sealed with an exchange of tokens, a ring, a piece of jewelry, or a symbolic object, which served as tangible proof of the promise made. Sometimes the groom might offer a betrothal ring to his future bride, a precursor to the wedding ring, signaling her new status and the binding nature of the agreement. The legal implications of sponsalia were profound. A broken betrothal was not a trivial matter. It could lead to significant financial penalties, severe reputational damage for both families, and even legal action in ecclesiastical courts. The church viewed the sponsalia as a sacred contract, a pre-sacramental commitment that, while not yet a full marriage, was a serious step towards one. It was considered a promise made before God, and breaking such a promise was seen as a moral transgression as well as a legal one. Lawsuits over broken betrothals were common, with one party seeking compensation for damages, loss of reputation, or the return of gifts and dowry installments already exchanged. The courts would meticulously examine the evidence, including witness testimonies and the tokens of agreement, to determine liability. This early betrothal period could stretch for many years, sometimes a decade or more, allowing the children to mature into adulthood. During this time, the families would often begin to integrate, fostering a sense of alliance and familiarity. The young man, now formally betrothed, would often begin to receive an education befitting his future role as head of a noble household, perhaps even spending time at the court of his future father-in-law to learn the customs and political landscape of his wife's family. The young woman, similarly, would be educated in the skills necessary to manage a large estate, oversee servants, and raise children, all while being constantly reminded of her future husband and the expectations that awaited her. This extended period of betrothal also served a practical purpose. It allowed time for the dowry to be fully assembled, for any necessary construction or preparation of the marital home to be completed, and for political situations to stabilize or shift in ways that might benefit the alliance. However, despite its binding nature, sponsalia was distinct from the actual marriage ceremony. The betrothal was a promise of future consent, while the marriage itself required a present explicit consent, per verba de praesenti, and, ideally, consummation. This distinction was crucial in medieval canon law. A betrothal could be dissolved under certain very specific circumstances, such as a discovery of a pre-existing impediment to marriage, like close kinship, or in cases of severe misconduct by one of the parties. Yet, such dissolutions were rare and always carried a social stigma. The weight of the promise, the public declaration, and the intricate web of family honor and financial interests meant that most betrothals, once established, were seen as unshakable commitments, guiding the lives of the young, noble individuals towards their predetermined, shared future. They were not merely agreements between two people, but between two powerful lineages, binding them together for generations to come. The future of their houses, their lands, and their very legacy depended on the fulfillment of this solemn promise. The formal promise of betrothal, while legally binding, was but one step on the long path to a medieval marriage. Before the actual wedding ceremony could take place, the Church, ever present and powerful in the lives of all, required certain preparations to ensure the union was not just socially acceptable, but also divinely sanctioned. This involved a crucial practice known as the publication of banns. Imagine a Sunday morning in a bustling parish church. As the congregation gathered, perhaps the air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of old stone and lingering incense. Before the final blessing, the priest would step forward and announce, in a clear, resonant voice, the names of those intending to marry. These were the banns of marriage, a public declaration made typically on 3 successive Sundays or holy days. The purpose was simple yet profound, to allow anyone who knew of an impediment to the proposed union to come forward and voice their objection. This was a vital safeguard against unlawful marriages. In an era before comprehensive record-keeping and widespread literacy, when people might move between villages or have hidden pasts, the community's collective knowledge was the primary defense against deceit. Perhaps one of the parties was already secretly married, a grave sin of bigamy. Or perhaps they had taken a prior vow of chastity, or were already betrothed to another. There could be questions of non-consent, though often subtly expressed, or even the hidden status of one as a cleric or a nun. The bans served as a crucial public inquiry, a call for transparency in a world where secrets could easily undermine the sanctity of marriage. It was a communal responsibility, a way for the entire village or town to ensure the moral and legal integrity of new unions. If no legitimate objections were raised by the community, the path to the altar became clearer, signaling that the union appeared sound in the eyes of God and man, free from hidden complications or moral transgressions. However, the question of kinship often presented a significant hurdle, especially for noble families whose very existence relied on strategic alliances forged through marriage. The Church's definition of prohibited degrees of relationship was far more expansive than anything you might imagine today. It extended not only to direct blood relations known as consanguinity, but also to those related by marriage, termed affinity, and even to spiritual kinship, such as between godparents and their godchildren. For instance, marrying a distant cousin or even the relative of a previous spouse could fall within these forbidden bounds. The Church's reasoning was rooted in biblical interpretation and a deep-seated desire to prevent what it considered incestuous unions, believing such relationships could lead to spiritual decay and moral disorder within society. Its practical application meant that even seemingly distant familial ties could render a marriage illicit or worse, entirely invalid in its eyes. For powerful families, this posed a constant challenge. Their limited pool of suitable partners, often from other noble houses with whom they shared distant ancestors, frequently meant that potential spouses were technically related within these forbidden degrees. To overcome such obstacles, a special permission, known as a dispensation, was required. Obtaining a dispensation was no simple matter. It involved a formal petition, often sent directly to the Pope or a high-ranking ecclesiastical authority, detailing the specific relationship and providing compelling reasons for the marriage to proceed. These reasons were almost always political or economic. The desperate need to consolidate fragmented land, secure vital alliances, prevent generations-long feuds that could devastate entire regions, or even solidify peace treaties. The process was lengthy, expensive, and often involved careful negotiation and considerable financial contributions to the Church. It was a clear demonstration of the Church's leverage and its central role in the political landscape of the Middle Ages, allowing it to exert influence over powerful secular rulers. Without a valid dispensation, a marriage could be annulled years later, potentially rendering children illegitimate and throwing entire inheritances and dynastic lines into disarray. The stain of illegitimacy was a devastating blow to any noble house, affecting succession rights, social standing, and even the perceived eternal salvation of the family. The Church, therefore, held immense power, acting as both a gatekeeper and a facilitator, shaping the very fabric of family and dynastic continuity through its control over the legality and legitimacy of marital unions. This intricate web of rules and permissions underscored how deeply intertwined religious authority was with the practical realities of medieval life, ensuring that even the most personal of unions, marriage, was ultimately subject to the overarching will of the sacred institution, a will that could bless or break a family's future and reshape the course of history for generations. With the betrothal secured and any necessary dispensations granted, the focus shifted to the culmination of all these painstaking arrangements, the wedding day itself. This was not merely a private affair between two individuals, it was a profound public declaration, a community event that solidified alliances and affirmed the future. The ceremony often began not within the hallowed confines of the church nave, as might be imagined today, but rather at the very threshold, at the church door. Imagine the scene, the hopeful couple, perhaps still young, their faces etched with a mixture of anticipation and solemnity, standing before the gathered community. Behind them, the proud and watchful families, representatives of their respective houses, their faces reflecting the weight of generations and the promise of future lineage. The air might carry the faint scent of damp earth or blooming flowers, depending on the season, mingling with the hushed murmurs of the assembled villagers or noble guests. The priest, a central figure in this sacred rite, would stand before them, his voice echoing with authority. Here, at the church door, the formal exchange of vows took place. These were not elaborate poetic declarations of undying love, but straightforward, legally binding promises. The groom would take the bride's hand, and each would solemnly pledge their consent to the union, often with words akin to, "I take thee," and "I take thee," a simple yet profound affirmation of their mutual will to marry. This public consent was absolutely critical in the eyes of the church. It was at this point that the rings were exchanged. The wedding ring, typically made of gold or silver, was more than a symbol of affection. It represented the eternal nature of the bond, a tangible sign of the unbroken circle of commitment. It was often placed on the fourth finger of the left hand, a custom believed to originate from the ancient belief in a vena amoris, or vein of love, that ran directly from that finger to the heart. After the vows and the exchange of rings, the couple would then enter the church, proceeding to the altar for the nuptial mass. This was where the union received its divine blessing, transitioning from a legal contract to a holy sacrament. The Mass would be filled with prayers for fertility, prosperity, and the spiritual well-being of the new couple, reinforcing the Church's role in sanctifying the union. Following the religious ceremony, the celebrations would move to a more secular yet still highly significant phase, the wedding feast. This was a grand display of hospitality and wealth, particularly for noble families. Imagine the great hall, perhaps adorned with tapestries, filled with the sounds of music, laughter, and the clinking of goblets. Long tables laden with roasted meats, fresh bread, and fine ale or wine served as a testament to the family's status and generosity. Guests would eat, drink, and make merry, often for several days, reinforcing social bonds and celebrating the new alliance. But the feast, for all its revelry, was merely a prelude to the final and, in many ways, the most critical step in validating the marriage, the consummation. This act, the physical union of husband and wife, was not a private, hidden affair as it might be viewed today. In the Middle Ages, particularly among the nobility, the bedding ceremony was a common and often public or semi-public ritual. After the feast, the bridal couple would be escorted to their bedchamber, often by an enthusiastic procession of family and friends. The bed itself might be blessed by a priest, and witnesses, sometimes even close family members, might be present in the room to ensure that the couple was indeed left alone together, thus verifying the opportunity for consummation. This might seem an intrusive custom to modern sensibilities, yet its purpose was deeply rooted in the legal and theological understanding of marriage at the time. For a marriage to be considered fully valid and indissoluble in the eyes of the church, it had to be both consented to and physically consummated. Consent formed the foundational bond, but consummation sealed it, transforming the promise into a complete and irreversible reality. Without this physical union, the marriage was considered merely a sponsalia de futuro, a promise of future marriage, or a matrimonium ratum sed non consummatum, a ratified but non-consummated marriage. Such a union, though legally entered into, could potentially be annulled by the church. The absence of consummation meant that the marriage had not yet achieved its primary purpose, which, from the church's perspective, included procreation and the full spiritual and physical merging of two souls. Therefore, the act of consummation was not just a private moment of intimacy, it was a public and legal necessity, the final, tangible proof that the marital contract had been fully executed and blessed by both human and divine law. It completed the complex tapestry of medieval courtship, weaving together property, politics, and piety into an unbreakable bond. Yet, beyond the joyous public rituals and the boisterous feasting, lay a fundamental principle that, at least in the eyes of the church, transcended all else: the crucial role of consent. While powerful parents meticulously arranged alliances, spending months or even years negotiating intricate details of dowries and dower, the church held a firm theological stance that a marriage could only be truly binding if both the bride and the groom freely assented to it. This was a revolutionary point of doctrine for its time, distinguishing Christian marriage from mere property transactions or forced unions. It meant that even if a mighty lord, seeking to expand his land or secure a crucial political alliance, decreed a union for his son or daughter, the individuals themselves had to audibly and unequivocally pronounce their "I do" without any visible or implied coercion. This consent, typically given at the church door during the public vows, was not merely a ceremonial formality. It was considered the legal and spiritual cornerstone upon which the entire marital structure rested. Its absence rendered the union void in God's eyes. However, the reality on the ground often presented a far more complex and challenging picture than this pristine ecclesiastical ideal. While the church vociferously preached free will and the sanctity of individual choice, the overwhelming social and economic pressures of the age frequently curtailed genuine freedom, particularly for young women. A daughter's primary purpose within a noble family was often to secure a beneficial alliance, a strategic move that could elevate her family's status, consolidate its land holdings, or forge peace with a rival house. Her parents' decisions, often made after extensive consultations and calculations, were considered paramount, almost divine in their authority. Disobeying them could lead to severe consequences, social ostracism, complete disinheritance, or even confinement to a convent, a stark and permanent removal from worldly life. Therefore, while a bride might physically speak the mandatory words of consent, her true agency in the matter was frequently minimal, if not entirely absent. Her yes was often a foregone conclusion, compelled by an intricate, almost invisible web of familial duty, unwavering loyalty, and the terrifying absence of any viable alternative. The daunting presence of a family patriarch, the cold, unyielding stone walls of an ancestral castle, the immense weight of a father's unwavering expectations, or the stern, disapproving gaze of a mother could be as powerfully coercive as any physical restraint, shaping her will without uttering a single threat. Instances of outright forced marriages, though explicitly condemned and considered sinful by the Church, were tragically not unheard of in the turbulent medieval landscape. Sometimes a powerful, unscrupulous family might resort to the extreme measure of abducting a desirable heiress, or a desperate father, facing financial ruin or political pressure, might literally compel his daughter to the altar through overt threats or even physical violence. In such rare but documented cases, if the complete lack of true consent could be unequivocally proven to ecclesiastical authorities, the Church might, after a protracted and incredibly difficult legal process, grant an annulment, effectively declaring the marriage null and void from its very inception. However, proving coercion was an almost monumental task, fraught with peril and immense difficulty, especially when the victim was often isolated, lacking resources, and utterly powerless against her family or abductors. The Church's ideal of individual consent was, in many ways, a truly revolutionary concept for its time, placing an unprecedented spiritual emphasis on personal will over purely familial dictates or cold economic calculations. Yet, it struggled constantly and often fruitlessly against the deeply entrenched societal norms, where lineage, inherited land, and raw power dictated unions far more often than burgeoning romantic affection or the quiet whisper of individual desire. The silent tears of a young bride, sometimes hidden beneath a heavy embroidered veil during the wedding ceremony, often told a more poignant story of reluctant acceptance and resigned duty, rather than one of joyful affirmation or eager anticipation. This delicate and often strained balance between spiritual doctrine and worldly pragmatism profoundly defined much of the marital experience for noble families throughout the Middle Ages, creating a subtle, almost palpable tension beneath the surface of every grandly arranged union. Yet, even as the Church spoke of free will and families' arranged unions for power and stability, another powerful, though often unspoken current began to flow through the minds and hearts of the medieval elite: the concept of courtly love. This was not the practical, contractual affection that might, over time, develop between a husband and wife in an arranged marriage. Instead, it was an idealized, intensely emotional, and often non-physical form of devotion, born not from legal agreements or family strategy, but from profound personal admiration and longing. It emerged in the 11th and 12th centuries, primarily in the sun-drenched courts of southern France, championed by wandering poets known as troubadours. These lyric poets, often from noble backgrounds themselves, sang of a refined, almost spiritual love directed towards a noble lady who was almost invariably married to another. Imagine a knight, cloaked in his finest silks, perhaps with the scent of lavender on his tunic, standing in the bustling courtyard of a great lord's castle. He would watch the lady of the castle, her graceful movements, the subtle curve of her smile, and feel a profound devotion stir within him. This devotion was meant to elevate him, to inspire him to greater deeds of chivalry, courage, and virtue. He would strive to be a better warrior, a more eloquent speaker, a more honorable man, all for the sake of her distant approval. The very suffering caused by this unattainable love, the constant yearning, was seen as part of its ennobling power. It was a love that purified the soul, pushing the lover to transcend his earthly desires and aspire to a higher state of being. The knight would compose poems in her honor, perhaps wear her favor in battle, or dedicate his victories to her unseen presence. Yet, this devotion was rarely, if ever, consummated physically. Its power lay in its idealism, in the very tension of its unfulfillment. It was a love that thrived on secrecy, on whispered glances across a crowded hall, on the subtle exchange of a token or a shared knowing smile. The relationship was often structured by a strict code of conduct, where discretion was paramount, and the lady's honor, and that of her husband, had to remain unsullied in the eyes of the world. This literary ideal presented a stark, almost fantastical contrast to the lived reality of medieval marriage. A typical arranged marriage was, as you know, a pragmatic affair. It was negotiated over tables laden with parchment, with calculations of acreage, feudal obligations, and familial prestige. The bride and groom might have met only briefly, if at all, before their betrothal. Their union was a public declaration, witnessed by the community, sealed by a priest, and designed to produce heirs and consolidate power. Love, if it came at all, was expected to grow slowly, from shared duties, mutual respect, and the common goal of maintaining their household and lineage. There was no room for grand, passionate declarations before the wedding, no expectation of a soulmate connection from the outset. Their bond was one of economic and social necessity, a practical partnership for survival and advancement in a harsh world. The cold stone walls of a castle, the smoke from the hearth, the daily grind of managing estates and retaining vassals, these were the tangible realities of marital life. Courtly love, on the other hand, offered an escape from this often austere reality. It allowed for emotional depth and personal passion that the arranged marriage system rarely accommodated. It was a realm of fantasy, a psychological refuge where individuals could experience intense romantic feelings without necessarily disrupting the social order. While a noblewoman's hand was given in marriage for strategic reasons, her heart, in the world of courtly love, could theoretically reside elsewhere. This created a fascinating duality: the public, sanctioned union for societal benefit, and the private, often illicit, emotional world of idealized affection. It was a dance between duty and desire, between the practical demands of medieval life and the yearning for something more profound, something personally fulfilling. The stories of courtly love, spread by troubadours and later by bards, became immensely popular, providing entertainment and a shared cultural language for the nobility. They offered a glimpse into a world where love was a transformative force, capable of inspiring heroism and virtue, even if it remained forever just beyond reach. These narratives, though often fictional, subtly shaped perceptions of love and marriage, creating a tension between what was practical and what was passionately desired. They spoke to a part of the human spirit that longed for connection beyond the confines of duty, for a love that felt chosen rather than imposed. It was a silent rebellion against the strictures of a world where individual desire often took a back seat to dynastic ambition, a testament to the enduring human need for emotional intimacy and romantic ideals, even in the most pragmatic of ages. Sometimes, however, the meticulously crafted plans of families and the rigid structures of society found themselves challenged by the unpredictable currents of human will or unfortunate circumstance. Not every courtship followed the carefully laid paths of negotiation, betrothal, and public ceremony. There were deviations, moments when the established order was bypassed, often with significant repercussions, both for the individuals involved and for the broader social fabric of the age. One such deviation was elopement, the act of a couple running away to marry without the consent of their parents or guardians. While this might sound like a romantic escapade from modern tales, in the Middle Ages it was a deeply serious matter, often fraught with legal and social peril. Young people, perhaps genuinely in love, or perhaps simply desperate to escape an unwanted arranged match, might decide to take matters into their own hands. A knight, deeply enamored with a lady, might convince her to flee with him, perhaps under the cloak of night, seeking a secret marriage, or a daughter, facing a union with an elderly or cruel suitor, might choose to escape with a commoner or even a younger, less wealthy noble. The Church's position on elopement was complex. While it generally upheld the necessity of parental consent for minors, it also maintained that a valid marriage required the free consent of both parties. Therefore, if an elopement involved two consenting adults, and they genuinely exchanged vows even without parental blessing, the Church might eventually recognize the marriage as valid, especially if it was consummated. However, the social consequences for the couple could be severe. They might be disinherited, cast out by their families, and face a life of ostracism or reduced circumstances, their reputation irrevocably stained, marking them as rebels against the established order. Even more disturbing than elopement was the practice of abduction, often a prelude to a forced marriage. This was not about mutual consent, however desperate, but about brute force and coercion, typically perpetrated by a man seeking to gain control over a wealthy heiress and her property. A lord, perhaps struggling financially or desiring to expand his lands, might orchestrate the kidnapping of a noblewoman, forcing her into marriage through threats, intimidation, or even violence. The Church was unequivocal in its condemnation of such acts. It held that true consent was paramount for a valid marriage, and consent obtained through fear or force was no consent at all. Abduction was therefore considered a grave crime, and any marriage resulting from it was, in theory, invalid. However, if the abducted woman was subsequently raped, or if the marriage was consummated, the Church might face a difficult dilemma. Sometimes, to prevent further scandal or to provide the woman with some semblance of legitimacy and protection, a marriage that began with abduction might be grudgingly validated, provided the woman eventually expressed some form of consent, however reluctant. When a marriage proved problematic, whether due to a forced union, a hidden impediment, or simply irreconcilable differences, the medieval church offered a path not to divorce, which was strictly forbidden, but to annulment. An annulment, unlike a divorce, did not dissolve a valid marriage. Rather, it declared that a marriage had never been valid in the first place due to some pre-existing impediment. The grounds for annulment were numerous and often complex. One of the most common grounds was consanguinity, or affinity, meaning the parties were too closely related by blood or by marriage. Given the limited pool of eligible nobles, it was remarkably easy to uncover some distant familial connection between a couple. Another significant ground was the lack of free consent. If it could be proven that one or both parties had been coerced, an annulment could be granted. Impotence, the permanent inability to consummate the marriage, was also a valid ground. The process for obtaining an annulment was a protracted and exceptionally expensive affair, primarily accessible to the wealthy and powerful. The implications were profound. Children born of an annulled marriage were, in the eyes of the church, considered illegitimate, though exceptions were sometimes made. But even these deviations, whether a bold elopement, a violent abduction, or the quest for an ecclesiastical annulment, only served to underscore one undeniable truth. Over all marital bonds in the Middle Ages, over every promise and every violation, the church loomed, unseen, but all-powerful. Its influence on the institution of marriage was comprehensive, penetrating the deepest layers of society, from royal courts to peasant huts, shaping not only the rituals, but the very understanding of matrimony itself. Initially, in the early Middle Ages, marriage was often seen as a private agreement between families, a kind of transaction secured by custom and the transfer of property. Over time, however, especially after the 10th and 11th centuries, the church began to assert its jurisdiction, gradually transforming marriage from a secular contract into a holy sacrament. This was a long but steady process through which the church sought to unify and regulate marital customs across Europe, introducing strict rules and moral doctrines. One of the key aspects of ecclesiastical control was determining the legality of a marriage. The church established certain impediments, obstacles that rendered a marriage invalid. The most common of these were consanguinity, blood relation, and affinity, relation by marriage. You could not marry a close relative, and these restrictions were far broader than those accepted today, sometimes extending to the seventh degree of kinship. For small communities or noble families seeking to keep wealth within their circle, this created significant difficulties. This is precisely why obtaining special church permissions, dispensations, became necessary. Without them, a marriage between relatives could be declared invalid, and the children deemed illegitimate, with colossal consequences for inheritance and social status. The consent of the parties was also crucial. Although marriages were most often arranged by parents, the church required that the bride and groom express their consent freely. In practice, of course, this free consent was often a mere formality, especially for women, whose disagreement could simply be ignored or suppressed. Nevertheless, in theory, a marriage entered into under direct coercion could be annulled. This provided a small, albeit limited, loophole for those who truly did not wish to enter into a particular union. The church also insisted on the public nature of the Marriage Act. This is why the practice of publishing the banns of marriage arose, where an upcoming wedding was announced in church on 3 consecutive Sundays. This gave anyone who knew of a legal impediment, such as a pre-existing marriage or close kinship, the opportunity to declare it. This practice was aimed at preventing secret, illicit unions and ensuring the transparency and legitimacy of the new marriage in the eyes of the community, and most importantly, the church. The wedding ceremony itself, which you are accustomed to seeing inside a church today, often took place at its doors in the Middle Ages. The priest would meet the couple and their witnesses bless them and say the prayers. Only after this, once they were officially husband and wife, could they enter the church for Mass and the sanctification of their union. This emphasized the transition from a worldly contract to a spiritual sacrament. The church also strictly regulated sexual relations within marriage. It was believed that marriage should be monogamous and indissoluble. Divorce, in its modern sense, did not exist. A marriage once contracted and, crucially, consummated, that is, physically completed, was considered unbreakable. The only way out of an unwanted union was an annulment, which declared that the marriage had never been valid from the start due to some impediment that existed at the time of its formation. This was far more complex than a modern divorce, requiring evidence and lengthy proceedings in ecclesiastical courts. The moral doctrines of the church also defined the purpose of marriage. First and foremost, it was for procreation to continue the family line and to prevent the sin of fornication. Love, while not forbidden, was not the priority and was often considered secondary to practical and spiritual goals. This created a certain tension between the idealized courtly love celebrated in poetry and the harsh reality of a marriage where feelings might develop only over time, if they developed at all. Thus, the church, with its unshakable authority, was the invisible yet omnipotent architect that built and maintained the foundation of marriage in the Middle Ages. It determined who could marry, how it should be done, and what happened when the rules were broken. Its teachings permeated every aspect of family life, from the birth and baptism of children to death and burial, shaping people's worldview and their relationship to their most intimate and important connections. Without understanding this all-encompassing power of the church, it is impossible to truly grasp how courtship and marriage worked in those distant times, when every yes or no could change not just 2 lives, but the fates of entire generations, subjecting them not only to the will of parents or kings, but to a higher divine law as interpreted by the church. It was within this complex web of rules, traditions, and beliefs that the foundation of medieval society was formed, where marriage was not merely a personal choice, but a cornerstone of the social order, sanctified and controlled by a single, all-encompassing power.